Well, happy Halloween, everyone. I am back today to actually give you a list because originally I was like, what movie do I want to cover on Halloween? It is very difficult for me to pick a film in this month to be like, I'm going to dedicate the day everyone gets excited for in October and pick one movie and say this is going to be the movie I'm going to discuss. And it was just too difficult for me this year to narrow it down and just say, okay, this is what I want to talk about on Halloween. It was too tough of a decision for me to make. So instead, I thought it would be fun to tell you guys some of my favorite films set on or close to Halloween. And it's funny to think about because the horror genre, I think we put these movies in October and focus it so much around Halloween, but not a whole lot of movies in the horror genre take place specifically on Halloween. Now think of like the Friday the 13th franchise that almost all takes place during the summer. I mean, there's a lot of films that we just kind of associate with that because of the scare factor, right? And so I thought today it would be fun to talk about some really well-known films or some films you may not have heard of before that I absolutely love that are centered around the holiday. So without further ado, let's get into it. First up, I want to mention one of my favorite films to watch around this time of year, which is Michael Dougherty's Trick or Treat. This is a film that the first time I watched it, I was not the biggest fan of it the first time I watched the movie. I don't know if it was because of how mean-spirited it is or how it comes across, but I did not love it the first time that I watched it. And I've revisited it multiple times since my initial watch, and my love for it continues to grow over time. And I think part of it is because of that really mean-spirited nature that the film has. It's like looking at the holiday in its truest form of like there's this sort of sadistic fun that Dougherty is having throughout the entire runtime of this film, kind of displaying these horror stories in a way that is brutal and relentless. I feel like so much horror, a lot of times you'll watch something, it'll like hit you with a punch at the end, but it'll like retcon a character's death or like do something to make it a little less intense, where I feel like Trick or Treat doesn't pull any punches. It's like, this is brutal, like it's going to continue to be brutal, but it still somehow manages to be really funny. And it's something that I appreciate a lot, is that he's able to juggle that tonality throughout the movie. I really love that it's an anthology film that is interconnected. It feels like a comic book almost, similar to like a Creep Show, where you're introduced at the beginning to this story. It's unraveling. All of the stories throughout the film interconnect at some point. Certain characters will pop up in moments in the new stories. I think compared to some of the anthology horror films I've seen, obviously the VHS series has become very popular over the past few years, especially with Shudder acquiring it and really kind of putting out one every single year. Anthology horror films are things people really look forward to. And I think the problem with anthology horror a lot of times is like two of the segments won't be good, and you're watching a film and you're like, okay, cohesively this doesn't work all together. But what I love about Dougherty's Trick or Treat, every segment works perfectly. I don't think there's a segment in this entire film that is weaker than the other one. They're all incredibly immersive. They all have great performances. The score to this film is one of my favorites around this time of year. I find myself listening to it nonstop. It has that perfect kind of Halloween energy that I'm looking for this time of year. And if you've never seen Trick or Treat, this movie, when it was first released, got screwed. It didn't even get a theatrical release. And I think it was this year or last year, I can't remember for certain, that they re-put it in the theaters for a while. And I know Dougherty says he's working on Trick or Treat 2 right now, which I'm really excited about because I absolutely love this movie, and I also love Dougherty's Krampus. He's just a really fantastic horror director. And if you've never seen Trick or Treat, go watch it. It's like a staple around this time of year. Next, and I just did a video on this recently, is the limited animated series Over the Garden Wall. And initially, you wouldn't know that this took place on Halloween until about the last 2 episodes of the series, but this series bleeds the aesthetic of fall. Just everything about it. The color palettes, the design of the towns that they go into, there's constantly like orange and brown leaves everywhere that just really immerse you into that world. The score that is in this limited event series, and what I love about it is it's very comedic. It has a lot of just absolutely hilarious moments that consistently had me on the floor laughing so hard, but it also has this really beautiful, dramatic, thoughtful core that really pays off in the last 2 episodes. I think it has some truly horrific imagery throughout it as well, with some of the characters that I was really impressed with, that it got as dark as it did in certain moments. And I think around this time of year, my favorite horror content is the kind that just kind of conveys a multitude of emotions. And I wouldn't necessarily call Over the Garden Wall a horror, but there are horror elements in it, and it definitely feels Halloween. Like, if you're looking for something that puts you in this space in this time, that Over the Garden Wall is absolutely perfect. And this is a fresher watch for me. I've already watched it through twice since I've watched it the first time, and I can't wait to revisit it a third time already. I just think it's absolutely perfect. I wish they would have done like 20 seasons of this. Unfortunately, it's the 10 episodes that we got, but if you're looking for something that's really going to make you feel this time of year, watch Over the Garden Wall. Up next, and this might be funny to some people, but for me, it's a staple around Halloween and takes place on Halloween, is Henry Selick's The Nightmare Before Christmas. Obviously, this does have Christmas in it as well as Halloween, but it does take place right on Halloween and then shortly after Halloween. And this is a movie that, honestly, I think I enjoy watching it on Halloween more than I do watching it on Christmas. The tonality of it, how darkly comedic it is, really fits into the Halloween season perfectly, a lot more than I think it does around Christmas. And that's not to say that I don't revisit this around Christmas, because I 100% do. It just, it kind of depends for me, but I love to watch this around Halloween. I love the stop motion animation in this. The attention to detail and all of the character design is just bar none some of the best in all of stop motion history. One of my favorite soundtracks ever. I love the original music in this. I love Oogie Boogie as a villain. I think he's absolutely incredible. I think Ed Ivory's vocal performance and the way that he sings the Oogie Boogie song is just a staple around this time of year for me. Every time I think about it, I love Danny Elfman's singing voice in this. I think that he does an incredible job singing these songs as Jack Skellington. I think that, you know, there's so many iconic moments in this that just really stand out to me. And obviously it pours out love for both holidays, Halloween and Christmas. And it's interesting because you think they're two holidays that convey very different things. There's joy in both, but obviously one is seen as a much darker time of year because of the horror element to it. And I think the way Selick is able to bring the two together in a way of like, hey, you can appreciate both of these things for very similar reasons is really cool to me. And it's one of my favorite films of all time. I have a huge Nightmare Before Christmas tattoo on my leg. It is one of my favorite Disney properties ever made, and I revisit it multiple times every year. Up next is going to be one of my favorite found footage horror films, and that is Stephen Cognetti's House LLC. This takes place, the initial incident that happens at the haunted house happens on Halloween night, as we're told at the beginning of the film. And so obviously the lead up to it isn't necessarily on Halloween, but it's in the season, it's leading up to that time period. And so I consider it a Halloween film. This is one of the most impressive found footage films to me because it has a very limited budget, and it is one of the scariest found footage films I've ever seen because of the way that Stephen Cognetti utilizes the budget that he has to create legitimate scares. And this movie does not have jump scares in it. It's not like every time you turn a corner, something's popping out in your face. So much of this movie is forcing you to look at really uncomfortable imagery. And that's what I love so much about it, is like you get this group of kids that has built haunted houses in downtown New York City year after year after year, and they're like, we want to do something different. So they find this hotel on the outskirts of New York that they can go probably get a lot more people in. They have to rebuild areas into the hotel into a fully functioning haunted house. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. And while they're there, obviously the place is actually haunted. And I think what's so interesting is watching our characters kind of slow mental decline through the runtime of the film. It's just really anxiety inducing and unnerving to watch. The clown, obviously, which goes around everywhere this time of year, images of the clown, is horrifying. I love how simple it looks, but it's truly terrifying. And I'm very excited because today on Halloween, the new Hell House Origins, is premiering, and I cannot wait. The trailer looked fantastic. I'm very excited to watch it. Hopefully get a review out for you guys soon. But House LLC, one of my favorite found footage films of all time. I recommend everyone watch it, especially this time of year. Another film I like to talk about this time of year that I don't think gets enough praise is The Guest from director Adam Wingard. And at the end of the film, the very final sequence takes place on Halloween at the high school at this event. And what's funny is atmospherically, the film doesn't necessarily feel like Halloween. It's in a desert landscape almost, which is really interesting. But in the third act of the film, when the blow up happens in this high school, there's actually an homage to Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. There's a lot of neon in this, a really incredible synth score. But what I like about this movie is how unconventional it is for a horror film. It's centered around this family who their son was in the military, and this man shows up, played by Dan Stevens, who comes to the house and says, "Hey, I served in the military with your son. I just wanted to come and visit you guys and talk to you." And the family ends up letting him live there, and he's not all that he seems to be. And it's a really unique movie in that the way that the anxiety and the tension builds throughout it is very unconventional. I think Dan Stevens' performance is incredible in this. It's one of the most unique roles he's ever taken. I really like Adam Wingard as a director. I think all his movies that I've seen, I've really enjoyed. And this is no exception. It's really interesting tonally, and if you've never seen it before, I think it's definitely worth checking out because there's a lot of comedy in it. And it's also really horrific, and it's very violent. It gets very violent, especially towards the third act of the film. This is one I always have a lot of fun revisiting around this time of year, and it's a unique Halloween movie because it doesn't necessarily feel like it takes place on Halloween, even though it does. Up next is a film that I don't think a lot of people remember that it takes place on Halloween, and that is Tobe Hooper's Poltergeist, which is a movie that meant a lot to me growing up. This was one of my initial gateway horror films into the genre, and still to this day, whenever I revisit Poltergeist, I always am just blown away by how horrifying this movie is, because it's not a bloody movie. It's not the most overtly violent film compared to something Tobe Hooper made like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's very different. And what I like about this movie is the core family. I think that adds a lot more stakes to the film, and seeing this family be put in this situation where they're being haunted, and the stakes just continue to grow and grow throughout the movie. Just the pacing of this thing and the way Tobe Hooper shot it is fantastic. I like the performances in this movie quite a bit. I think the atmosphere is perfect for this time of year, and it's truly scary. It's the scene with the little clown puppet thing doll. It still scares me to this day. It has since I was a very little kid. Obviously, some people might say the stuff in the third act doesn't look as great as it used to. I still think it looks awesome. I still enjoy it every time I go to revisit it. There's not much more I can say about a movie that's an absolute classic like Poltergeist, but it's amazing, takes place around this time of year, and I think it's perfect to watch around this time of year as well. Obviously, I could keep this list going and going, but I'm going to give you guys one more, and the film I'm going to talk about, no, I'm not going to bring up John Carpenter's Halloween, although you probably thought I was going to. Too obvious. The last film I want to talk about is The Blair Witch Project, another found footage film that takes place in the month of October, around the Halloween season. And there's been a lot of talk about this movie over the past couple years where people are like, is it actually that scary? Does it hold up without the marketing? And I think it's still one of the scariest found footage films ever made, because this is before intricate GPS technology or MapQuest or any of this stuff. And these guys go into the woods to investigate this story about the Blair Witch. And we get a lot of information about it at the beginning. And obviously in 1999, I believe, when this was released, the whole thing about it was, is it real? Did this actually happen? And they marketed it like it was a true story. And I think that's brilliant marketing from the people who came up with this idea. But watching it now, the thing that really unsettles me the most about it is that feeling of isolation and loneliness, and just the fear that you're never going to get back home. And that's something that I think all of us have experienced at least once in our lives. If you've been lost somewhere, I think you've experienced that and gotten in that headspace. And I think the director does a phenomenal job conveying that level of horror. And it's a movie that every time I rewatch it, it still unsettles me to this day. And if you've never seen the Blair Witch Project before, you're missing out. So what are some of your favorite films that take place on or around Halloween? Let me know in the comments. This is just a brief list. It grows and grows every single year, but I'd love to hear some of yours. As always, you can like the video and subscribe to the channel. Helps me out a lot and lets me know the type of content you're looking for. I'm always putting out new material and look forward to getting more out for you in the near future. And as always, everyone, thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.